Yes, Arizona is a community property state, and that controls how almost everything in the state gets divided. Whether that's property or debt, it's all going to be governed by the community property laws, which, by the way, Arizona is one of 9 states that identify as community property states. Community property in Arizona includes a lot more than people realize. Really, community property encompasses anything, and we should say community property and debt encompasses anything that you acquire during the marriage, with 3 very small exceptions. Well, one of them can be big. Real property is one of those exceptions. So real property acquired during the marriage does not automatically fall under the community property laws. The second exception are gifts that you receive during the marriage. And the third would be inheritances. So if a family member dies, something like that, they leave you money. That's not automatically considered community property. Everything else, property or debt acquired during the marriage, is typically going to start with the presumption that that's community money. Separate property does exist in Arizona, but it's difficult to keep it categorized as separate property. So typically when we're talking about separate property, we're going to be talking about property that you acquired prior to the marriage. So that home that you bought prior to actually marrying your spouse, or that vehicle that you had going into the marriage that was already paid off, or property that you acquired after the marriage. That could be property you acquired even after the date of service in your marriage, so during your divorce case. Or we're going to be talking about property that is not categorized as community property. So one of the exceptions to the community property rule, meaning real property, inheritances, or gifts. Those are how we are going to categorize sole and separate property. It's really important, though, that you keep that property separate. So if you, for instance, had money in your bank account at the time that you got married, and you choose to take that money that you had at the time you got married and to deposit it into an account with the money you're making during the marriage, and then you're using money out of that account, you're putting money back into that account, we're calling that co-mingling. And now what you've done is you've taken that sole and separate property and you've reclassified it as community property, meaning you effectively gifted your spouse half of that sole and separate property. So you want to be really careful with your sole and separate property. Make sure that it stays your sole and separate property. In Arizona, community debt is divided typically the same way we divide community assets. So usually each party is going to get half of whatever we categorize as community debt. Now, in an ideal situation, the community debt will be paid off with money that we have, which community assets, and then the parties will split the remaining assets. If that's not a possibility, then the court may actually delegate that each party take and be responsible for, in fact, even hold each other harmless of, half of that debt. Business division in Arizona is not just about value, it's also about ownership. So half of that component is figuring out, what is this business actually worth? We have to tie a specific monetary value with that business so that we can go forward with the process of evaluating it. Then we have to figure out, how much is the community actually entitled to? If husband owns 100% of that business, the community would be entitled to the entirety of the business. If husband owns 50% and a non-marital person owns the other half of that business, then the marital community would only be entitled to husband's ownership of that business. So it's important that we look at the value component, and usually we're going to have someone actually come in and tell us what that value is, a business evaluator, and then we're looking at the ownership component to figure out what exactly the community is entitled to out of that business ownership. Retirement and investment accounts in Arizona go through a process in division that we call QDRO, Qualified Domestic Relations Order. And the process of a QDRO for a layperson, basically what that means is we're having an attorney who's very good at math figure out what you're entitled to. And the reason is these are complex accounts. So we're talking about, for instance, a retirement account, a 401k that you had at the time that you got married. You had already put money into it prior to entering into the marriage. Then during the marriage, you continued to put money into that 401k account. Of course, during the marriage, your money also grew. The interest accrued, and that growth was not just on the money that you were putting in during the marriage. The money you had in there at the time of your marriage that you put in prior to the marriage also grew and accrued interest. And so we have these attorneys that are very good at math, perform these QDROs. They go in, they figure out what exactly is the community entitled to, and then they assist with the process of actually dividing those retirement accounts because of tax penalties. Sometimes that may mean transferring funds into a similar account rather than just pocketing cash out of the account.